And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to everyone who's attending us today. We are incredibly excited to have you all here for our CU RMACC webinar series. So we have already had a couple of these and we plan to have more of them, typically, hopefully about one a month, along with our NAIR pilot series that we are doing with our industry and academic partners. So stay tuned for more presentations throughout the coming year. So today we are happy and ready to have our first presenter. And so this is going to be Gil Speyer, who is the Director for Research Technology Office, Computational Research Accelerator at Arizona State University. So Gil, I will turn it over to you and we will sort of converse with people in the chat. And if you have questions for Gil, please drop them into the Q&A so that we can ask those live at the end of his presentation.
Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Looks
Yes.
good.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Alana, and so glad to have everyone here. I want to give a little context for this talk. I mean, clearly, in this period of time we have, it's to give an overview of AI tools and applications, or and kind of get the sense of all this is a huge task. And what I want to do is maybe set some expectations, and maybe if anything, kind of give a sense of where supplemental type of help with this type of information can be found. And the intro to the workshop that was given by NAIR a few months back had a series of these types of talks, and this was an earlier form of this talk was given there. And what I really liked about it was there were talks with titles like Intro to AI. There was this one that was an overview of AI tools. There was another one called, computational resources for AI. And what you kind of hear in those titles is there sort of sounds like there might be a bit of overlap, and there was. But what was great about it was there was this reinforcement of a lot of terms and a lot of ways of describing these types of resources that I think helped a lot as people sort of develop their understanding over the course of that day. Now, here we have this one talk, and there's going to be other talks in this series, which will be great to have a similar effect. But in the meantime, I would just say, take note of some of these terms if they're not familiar. And what might be a great exercise is to just sort of have a chat about this topic and anything you don't understand with GPT. I think it's kind of a weird meta way to have to further understanding. But let's get started and talk about what the outline will be here. So I'll go over some of this terminology, not all of it. There's a lot of different types of terms, but things I think that will be meaningful to this talk. And then I'm going to talk about, when we talk about a tool for AI, we may think of software tools, but really the graphics processing unit, which is a piece of hardware, is a critical piece, a critical tool for using AI. And so I'm going to describe what those are. And then we'll talk about the kinds of tools in terms of the open source and the industry, mainly through cloud providers that are available. And this is going to be, what help give me a bit of focus here is that this is going to be really in terms of what would be accessible through this NAIR pilot and the wide variety of tools that are available there. Access and integration will be about how these tools can be used in a variety of different ways, and then maybe some future directions. What you see here to the right is an image that I created using GPT-4 as the text interface, and then it produced an image using a method called a diffusion model to create this image that you see here. And my prompt was produce an image for a workshop on AI tools where the attendees are animals native to Colorado. And it created this image here. And the process by which a diffusion model works is that this prompt that is text, this text is then, these are converted into what are called tokens. And these tokens are one way to think about them are these embeddings, which means it's sort of a data representation of what these words are, is formed. And this data is then sent to you might conceive of it as a computer program, but is called a model. And that model is able to is able to draw in images that are related to those tokens. And those images, there's a wide variety of them that might relate to the different concepts or the different ideas or the different objects that are referred to in that prompt. And they're all brought together through this diffusion. And then there's this and as you might imagine, all these images, it creates a large amount of noise. And then there's this process, this reverse diffusion, where a single image is created that integrates all of these elements together. And I'll go into further description of this, but that's how this specific type of process works. So I mentioned this thing called a model, and a model maybe is exactly what you might conceive of. It's this representation or imitation of something, right? And what do we think of it in terms of these AI models is it's representing sort of this process through which maybe words are converted into this prompt of words might be turned into maybe a larger or different type of text, or maybe it's turned into an image, and that process typically involves these fundamental decision elements that are shown represented here in this image that you see on the right. So we'll start off with just basically a simple definition of machine learning, which is sort of this superset of all these different types of representations of what people want to accomplish with these programs. The very simplest machine learning idea you might think of is something like a linear regression, where maybe we've got a set of data, and we want to train this program, which means we want this program to essentially produce another program. You could think of it that way, as an example, let's say I have a list of house sizes and house prices in a specific area. What I want my program to do is to produce a program that's very simple. It's going to basically map a line to all of that data. And then what happens is once I have that line is actually a very, very, very simple program, right? Because it's just a slope and an intercept. But then what I can do is I can take new data. I can take a new house size, a new set, square footage. I can input it into this program, and it's going to give me out a price. Now, is that price going to be accurate? Well, probably not, but maybe within a certain error range, it's actually a pretty darn good prediction, right? But as you might imagine, a lot of these types of relationships may not be linear. So we got to go to more sophisticated machine learning models, maybe things that can do curves. And then we may have other inputs, right? So now the dimensionality of this problem starts to increase. So maybe we're not really doing a line, maybe we're doing a plane, or maybe instead of a curve, we're doing a surface. As you might imagine, these machine learning models can get more and more sophisticated. But just imagine if we were to take a bunch of these models, all these different decision elements, and we would start to couple them together into these layers. And then, as you can hear with these layers, you can see them in this representation here. These couplings may be between the elements in the layer, but they may be between the different layers themselves. And what those allow is for decision-making processes that can have incredible breadth and depth, not just in space, but also in time. And what I mean by that is just imagine a sequence of words, and we're trying to predict what the next word is going to be. We're going to try to do this next token prediction, right, for this language that we're able to suddenly be able to simulate. And so we're able to model using these incredibly large numbers of decision elements in these multi-layered models, actual language, intelligent language being produced. And it is astonishing. We can give these prompts, and they're not just filling in the next sentence in the word, but they're filling in the next sentence in the paragraph, the next paragraph in an entire essay. They have this ability to be able to develop these really large-scale outputs based on this ability to harness all of these different couplings. Now, I want to stress that there is one of the things you may hear about is in terms of these weights and these couplings between these decision elements, is that the magnitude of these weights and couplings kind of is described in a sort of anthropomorphic way. As a lot of these terms you're going to hear are, right? I mean, when we talk about things that are intelligent or things that are trained, things that are perceptive, the term is called attention. And what it means is that the data set will have all these, the data set gets fed in, and what the model ends up doing is through the magnitude of these weights and couplings, um, is going to determine which features are important. So for example, let's say we're trying to train a model to tell the difference between pictures of cats and dogs, there's going to be certain features in these images that's going to give more attention to, and it's going to help it in that determination. And conversely, there's going to be things that it's going to ignore. And those things are going to have very, very low magnitude, maybe very close to zero. And as a result, we may be able to eliminate some of those decision elements from this. And that's an interesting process that could be brought to bear as well. I'm going to use this term perception AI and generative AI, and these are this is sort of one of the formulations of how these models have been progressing. There's other steps beyond this that I'll talk about in the conclusion, and we'll define what those are. But I'll get into those in slides ahead. Let's talk about the graphics processing unit. We often we work with these computers and we have these CPUs, and they have had an incredible impact, and especially with the advances in the technology of fabricating these CPUs has been really fantastic, and we've gotten greater and greater computer power. But maybe I think it's more than 20 years ago, there was this revelation that a group of guys had about a new type of silicon, a new type of integrated circuit that would be able to handle the specific kind of processing that might be used in like a video game, where you move a joystick and all of the pixels in the image suddenly change. They change in the coloring, they change in the shading. All of these things had to happen simultaneously. And a CPU just wasn't able to handle that type of processing. So what they did was they created a new type of integrated circuit. And as you can see in this cartoon here, what you sort of see is it has thousands of compute elements. It has its own memory, which is that DRAM. But the thing to realize is they're drawn a little bit smaller, not just to fit them all. And this isn't the thousands. The thousands isn't even represented here, but it's thousands of these. But to also, it's meant to indicate that these are very lightweight types of computing units. And so as a result, there's a certain type of computation that becomes really effective on the GPU. But any deviation from that, the CPU would be able to handle. The type of computing is the type of computing you might imagine in a video game, which is something that has lots of ample data. So there's tons of these pixels that have to be computed. But on top of that, all of these pixels have to be basically executing the same code. It's just on different data. So the pixel it's operating on is going to be different, but everybody's going to be doing pretty much the same thing. There can't be lots of branching and things like that. Well, there was this discovery that the GPU is actually good for things other than graphics processing. And in 2012, AlexNet, which was a deep learning model, was written to run on a GPU. And the discovery was that it took, instead of months to train a model, it took days. And this really was a really huge inflection point in the development of these types of artificial intelligence. It was used, the application was for an image classification, and this turned out to be just the GPU turned out to be ideal for this. So it's able to have all these linear operations. It's a huge number of parameters that it has to solve. Those are all the couplings and weights I was talking about. You could process large batches on it. There's obviously, you could think of all the ample data it has to run on, whether it's a huge trove of images or all the text corpuses that comes from the internet, whether Wikipedia or Reddit or Stack Overflow, all those things. They're so ample that it was able to have plenty to crunch on. And furthermore, what was also interesting discovery was that the GPU, the lower the precision, actually, the better performance you get with it. And it turns out that low precision on these parameters turns out to have a pretty high tolerance for having low precision. In other words, these models seem to perform pretty well even when you lower the precision of these parameters. Sometimes extremely low. So when I say some of these parameters can be reduced to to just a byte. I mean, so 256 as the maximum value, and still they perform really well. And so the GPU turned out to be these this technology. Once it became mature and available, suddenly the AI winter ended, and we are in the situation we are in today. What I'm going to show you here, this is a program that's running a Python package called Keras, which under the hood has TensorFlow, which is that image there to the right. This program is, there's a lot of data here, but I just want to point out some specific things. First of all, the model has all these layers, right? So these were defined, I defined these different layers in my models. So just to show you sort of what a deep learning model kind of looks like, it has these different types of layers. They may have different functions in them, but they all sort of work through this. The total number of parameters you see here is just 2.7 million. Just to give you a scale, I mean, typically you'll see, when you see these models defined, they will describe the number of parameters they have. Maybe it'll be in the billions for models that you can download and use. And something like GPT-4 and some of these really large ones in the cloud, we're talking about models that go into the trillions of parameters. But what I've highlighted here in the red square is just that I try to run the model using a CPU. And what happens is, these Python models are fantastic. They automatically detect what hardware is available. This one just detected a CPU, so it said, okay, I'm going to use that. And it runs a single epoch, which means when you're training these models, it's a very iterative process where these parameters are iteratively refined. It means it keeps cycling back until it has the level of discernment of the whatever constraints you're trying to put in defining this model, until it's acceptable, right? So you may say, hey, keep iterating this thing until I get 90% accuracy telling the difference between a cat and a dog. And so it'll keep iterating. What you see here is one epoch, 1 out of 60, takes 36 seconds on a CPU. I run this again, but now I make a GPU available. And by the way, this is a V100 GPU. So this is like 4 generations old. Right now, the GPUs today are even far more powerful and have far more memory. So with this would be processed far faster. But you can see 3 seconds, it has an order of magnitude improvement in the performance of computing that epoch. Okay, so let's talk about this perception AI. What you see on the right is a picture I took from Wikipedia, and what it's trying to do is tell the difference between 2 sets of images. This time it's going to be these starfish with this sort of bubble type texture, and then these sea urchins with the stripe texture. And it's going to, and this model is going to train. And what you can see here is that the 2 sets seem to be pretty distinct, except there is this one sea urchin that has the spots on it. And so what ends up happening there is that this creates a very, very weakly weighted association between that texture and that shape. And what I want you to take away from this is that there's this statistical nature to these workflows. These parameters are very seldom 1 and 0. They're somewhere probably in between, and they're trying to create these associations. And by the way, this type of process is what's kind of done in a process called supervised learning, where these sets of images it's not only the images that have been input to this program, but they've all been annotated with what they represent. So in other words, all those images say starfish in some metadata, and all these have sea urchin. And they're all, and so the model is able to train based on that labeling. And when we label the data sets ahead of time before we put it in, this is called supervised learning. We're telling it what exactly we want it to the distinction we want it to detect. And this is done with things like speech recognition, where waveforms are the inputs, but they're all labeled with the word in text that's being articulated. And there's and these types of tools are available through Meta AI and OpenAI, which are 2 cloud providers that we'll get into. And this is also, you might imagine, with images, things like images you might imagine that might be used, for example, in medical. So let's say you uploaded 1,000 images of some kind of a spot in an X-ray, and 1,000 of them, let's say 500 of them are where it's a tumor that's malignant, and half where it's benign. And what you're going to try to do is have the model train. Usually you have to have by the way, a far larger number of images than that. But but then you're trying to have the model detect through the texture of the image, right, whether these things are benign or malignant. And or maybe if you're a dermatologist and you take a bunch of images of moles and melanomas, and you just want to be able to the model to be able to detect it. But and I should say these are not hypotheticals; these have been done. And what's really spectacular is that when you have enough images in this data set where it can tell, where it's able to use these really large numbers of decision elements, they become extremely effective. And you might they end up actually when they test them against a group of radiologists that are trying to determine what that spot is, or dermatopathologists who are trying to tell a mole from a melanoma. These models end up outperforming these doctors, and it kind of makes sense why they would, because what you have is this really large data set. So it's really like having thousands and thousands of doctors sort of being able to determine in one single model what these what exactly is being presented. Now, the I want to talk a little bit about sort of how these models are set up, because there's typically a standard way of doing this, which is you have this entire set of annotated data, and you take most of it and you use it to train the model, but you don't use all of it, because there is a danger with these models, or not a danger, but it's something you want to try to avoid, which is you don't want it to train on the training set. In other words, you don't want it to sort of be able to identify the spotted sea urchin, and you want it and know that it's a sea urchin because from the label it has, from that specific image, and know that it's trained on that. Because then when we go and use this, right, this is a program that writes a program again. So then we use these parameters in this model, and we load it up after the training and this step I'm describing, where we're using it to throw images at it hasn't seen before, and this is called inference. When we use these models for inference, they end up failing really badly. And so that's what the test set is for. It's to give it images that it hasn't trained on and see how well it performs with those. And as a result of the test set, what you can do is you can go through the model, and there's a process where sort of some of these parameters are reset, or there's this process of sort uh, of, 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 of sort of scaling back some of these couplings in such a way that it's more robust to data that it hasn't seen before in getting those the distinction read accurately. And then finally, when the entire process is done after multiple iterations, there's a validation step that gives you the final representation of this model to data that it hasn't seen before, and how well it's able to tell between the two sets. So this is the typical process of doing this. There's all kinds of open source tools for this type of AI. First of all, it's great to know about Hugging Face, which is basically this giant repo of all kinds of AI and machine learning models that are available to download and use. TensorFlow and PyTorch that were developed by Google and Meta respectively are extremely popular for doing this. And these neural nets are built, and there's all kinds of versatility in the types of models that you want to make and what do you want to apply them to, whether it's for natural language processing, computer vision. Now, NVIDIA is the dominant player in the hardware and so CUDA is the NVIDIA proprietary code in which all of these models are built. But I do want to say that, which a lot of them are built, but there is support for ROCm, which is for the AMD GPUs. And there are other GPU varieties out there as well that may have support. So it's not exclusively NVIDIA's that within this market, but and so I just want to make that clear. But NVIDIA has done an enormous amount of development in this area. One example of this is with the scikit-learn library, which is a Python library that ran on CPU. It's an incredible number of tools in there. And there's a Rapids project, which is run by NVIDIA, where they, for example, created this CUML library equivalent that runs on the GPU, but just sometimes 2 to 3 orders of magnitude faster on the type of program it's running. And the only change you have to make to the Python code is just changing the name of the library you're importing at the top of the code. So it's pretty dramatic performance improvement. I've been talking about Python a lot because it really does seem to dominate the software that's being written in this area, but there is a torch for R, which is, and so for you R users, there is that available. Um, I also want to, it is a commercial code, and so maybe not, it depends on its availability on a lot of these different resources, but the MATLAB AI toolkit has been developed for a very long time and has a lot of wonderful tools to use there as well. Then there are also tools that you can, you don't have to build your own models. There's models that you can download and use. And one of these I want to point out is called Sleep. It's this deep learning model for doing this pose tracking for animals. So just there's a lot of behavioral psychologists and people who look at animals in cages and see maybe the effect of, who knows, giving them a drug or giving them or depriving them of sleep or whatever the study is. Speaking of sleep deprivation, there's usually hours and hours of video that a grad student is tasked with watching and looking at the behaviors of these animals. Well, now this can be automated with this software. So this is a supervised learning because there has to be the images, the objects that want to be tracked have to be clicked on in the UI. But once that has happened, the software takes over and is able to track the motions of these animals in a variety of different ways. Another tool, this is also developed by NVIDIA, is called Monai. This is for medical images. There's two I don't know, different sections of the code, this application. One is for the labeling. So this would be things like where you annotate images. This can also, by the way, not just on 2D, but 3D images. And then there's something called Monai Core, which is able to do things like segmentation, which is when you go into an image, you might click on a specific region. Like let's say you were clicking on the brain and you wanted to know what its volume was, and it can use AI to measure the volume within that three-dimensional image, or the area within a 2D image. These are, could be run in different ways. There's Python packages that can be downloaded, but I also want to point out that a lot of this software can be run in what's called a container. If you're not familiar with the container, it is a sort of a it's a package with the environment, the software, all downloadable. You are able to connect to your data sets that are local to it, and then you run these things. It's actually a great tool if you're interested in reproducibility. It has I think the ease of use has been greatly increased, and it's certainly something worth investigating for your workflows. Now, another thing that can be done is that once all of these parameters and in the model, these weights and these couplings have been determined, and have identified the important features within the data sets that are being interrogated by these models now have the capability to produce their own data from the patterns on those features that it's learned from them. And this is an unsupervised type of training, or sometimes it's called self-supervised training, where and this is the kind of experience we have when we're working with things like stable diffusion, or these diffusion models, or which produce images, or these transformer models that produce things like text through when we're doing these chats. The way in which these chat models basically work is that there's this next token prediction that is implemented inside these models. They basically take sentences and they give themselves they give exercises where they try to predict what the next word's going to be, and they keep training and training on these corpuses, these enormous corpuses of text, until they're able to predict what those next words are going to be with some statistical accuracy. Obviously, the next word can vary, right? When we're forming sentences in our minds, maybe we try to make these substitutions with various synonyms of what we're going to say. That's all built into these models, and what makes them so amazing. They're not deterministic all the time. You may give it a prompt and it may give you a different answer, and that's because of that statistical nature of these. I just want to point, the three images you see here is a prompt that I gave to a diffusion model. It's what's really amazing. So let me tell you what the prompt was. I said, I'd like to see an image of a Civil War general and a walrus in a concert t-shirt solving a Rubik's Cube in a Chinese restaurant. So there's really like four well, maybe five elements here, right? I got the Civil War general, the walrus, the concert T-shirt, the Rubik's Cube, and the Chinese restaurant. And as you can see, I prompted it three times. I got three different images, and it's pretty spectacular, right? It's very photorealistic. The lighting is amazing. I mean, the general and the walrus look. I mean, it's just astonishing, right? And it didn't get the concert T-shirt in the second image, and so but I have to say I was pretty impressed with what it was able to produce from this sort of I mean, certainly this idea I had that I couldn't imagine it could go into some library and actually find anything like this. And here it was able to create it with this diffusion model. Now, um, what's interesting, I don't know how many of you in the audience are have kids or young kids or have had young kids but maybe a lot of us have a bit of around kids that are 5 or 6 years old. But when your kid comes home from school, you're that young, and they've drawn a picture, and usually the picture of the family or whoever they're drawing is stick figures, and they're not photorealistic, not at all. But what I found to be incredibly a common thing to see almost all the time is that these pictures that I would get from my kids, they would have these two arms with two hands, and each hand would have they would be huge, by the way, but they would each have 5 fingers drawn on each hand, very deliberately and very accurately. And what's amazing, which you've heard probably about these models, is you ask it to draw people, and it draws them incredibly well. But oftentimes it seems to have a problem with getting 5 fingers on the hand or even two hands. And it's kind of astonishing, this weird inaccuracy that comes in to these images. And what I'm kind of touching on here is this phenomenon called Moravec's paradox. And the paradox is is that there are tasks that humans find incredibly simple that they can do when they're 5 years old, that a machine, no matter how many GPUs you throw at it, right? No matter how many parameters you add to that model, has a very, very hard time doing. And conversely, there are tasks that a machine can do seemingly just within seconds, right? Can produce these images that human beings would find incredibly hard to do. What I want to point out in this image, you can see in the image on the left, the general is holding 3 chopsticks. And never in any of these images do we see the normal expected 3 by 3 by 3 Rubik's Cube. It just can't seem to do it. So what I say when I talk about this is just to give you a bit of caution about these models in terms of you'll hear terms like hallucinations, where you're asking the model for information in one of these large language models, and it gives you back something that's simply not true. Whenever we use these tools, we should have a little bit of scrutiny that we apply to them. Another example that I love is the ability for these large language models to produce code. And this code generation, this auto machine learning kind of capability is I guess it might be a marketing term, auto machine learning, but this ability to create code. So here's an example. I went into GPT, and I uploaded 2 data sets, one with the historical baseball fielding statistics and the hitting data. And I loaded them both up, and I didn't say anything about them. I didn't give any descriptors. And I just gave it that prompt, which says compile a list of third basemen with the most career triples. Now that prompt is doing something. It's saying, I want you to identify a list of people by their fielding stats, right? Because third base is a defensive position. And I want you to basically do a join on all those third basemen you identify. And I want you to find their hitting stats and I want you to total up all of the games and all the seasons of those players and give me the most career triples. To the right, you see the code that it was able to generate, and it does everything I asked it to do. What's really amazing is all the things that I didn't have to say. For example, in the fielding stats, there is a position column next to everyone's name, and it has 3B written there. Just the letters 3 and B. The letter 3, well, the number 3 and the letter B. And in the hitting stats, there's a column heading that says 3B, which indicates triples. All of this was deduced by the LLM without me telling it anything. It was able to figure out exactly what I was looking for. And as you can see here, it produces this table. And so I looked at this table and I thought, wow, this is interesting. Ty Cobb, I don't remember him being a third baseman. Nor Holmes Wagner and all these guys it's listing here. It's kind of interesting. By the way, these are the sort of these weird code names that it came up with these because I didn't give it the actual. It doesn't have the actual names there, but that's what it does the join on. Um, but then I looked into the data, and it turns out Ty Cobb did play third base very, very rarely in a couple of games, but that was enough for the model to sort of label him as a third baseman. So the point is that you have to be able to really give some scrutiny to what you're asking these models to do. Yet another example of sort of an error with these. I want to talk about some scientific AI applications. AlphaFold is a really compelling example. The input is a series of amino acid codes, and the output is a structure. This is a problem that has been worked on for decades by computer scientists, structural biologists, to try to solve. Every 2 years is a competition called CASP. And what you see on the right is this test that was given on by all the different computational biologists. They brought in their codes, and they said, okay, we're going to give you a amino acid sequence for a structure that we've actually been able to deduce experimentally. Let's see how different your models do. All of these models until 2016 were pretty much hovering around the same level of accuracy. All of a sudden, this AI model is submitted in 2018 called AlphaFold, and it blew away all the other competition. And then AlphaFold 2 came back 2 years later and got almost 90% accuracy. And now there's an AlphaFold 3. This is really is shown to people as an example of how AI can really offer immense, dramatic improvements over what we've been able to do before computationally. And this was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year to John Jumper and Demis Hassabis, who developed this software. And this moves on. So, by the way, a lot of these examples I'm going to give for scientific AI are in the computational biology domain, but believe me, there's all kinds of things happening in a lot of variety of other domains as well. BioEmu is just another development where now it's not, instead of just training on sequences and experimentally determined structures, it's actually looking at all the different conformational states of proteins, basically by training on molecular dynamics simulations. And so we're able to see the protein in all of its different conformations, and statistically where it seems to where it seems to be the most. But you can also, as you might imagine, the language that we feed into these corpuses of languages don't have to necessarily be human languages. They can be genomes. So now there's this Evo2, which was released just this year. What it did was they trained on all these different genomes, trillions of base pairs across all these different species, and it was able to detect all kinds of interesting features. Exon intron boundaries. These are the places, the genes, right, that code for the proteins and determining what parts of the DNA do that. Transcription factor sites, all kinds of structural elements, places in the genome that viruses came in and inserted some of their code into, and predicting where mutations in the genome would be deleterious or completely benign. And it was able to do all of this to deduce all this. Moreover, Evo2 can be used generatively. You can ask it to do, hey, can you create a gene sequence for me that has this type of function? And it'll give you a sequence of nucleotides, which you can then go and look and see after transcription and translation, the protein it generates, and these turn out to be highly accurate. What you see on the bottom is a genome that they didn't put in the training set for the woolly mammoth, and it was able to accurately determine all of the gene coding regions within this mammoth genome. And just a couple of other models I want to mention that just came out. I mean, some of these I just discovered last week, but there's a single cell foundation model, which is able to take single cell transcription data. Now we're looking at RNA transcription abundances. It creates something called a sentence out of these readings, where it lists each gene, its abundance, and it lists them in a kind of a sentence type format. And it's able to so you give it the readings, and it can tell you back all kinds of information about the types of cells you're observing, and it also has generative types of capabilities. Domain-specific models have been an interesting development that we've observed in the past year, where instead of having it learn on a corpus of text like Wikipedia or Reddit or Stack Overflow, you give it a huge number of journal articles um, and um, and textbooks and have it train on those. And so ChemDFM was trained on 11 million journal articles, for example, and 11,000 chemistry textbooks. It can interpret all kinds of chemistry types of formulations like SMILES format or IUPAC format. Another one for astronomy called AstroSage is also available for download and use. I'm just going to go briefly over these cloud offerings, but just to say that these are really, here's where you're going to be able to find these large language models with numbers of parameters that are on the order of magnitude of the trillions, and be able to use those. There's all kinds of wonderful capabilities available through these. Microsoft Azure, Google AI has been able to do amazing things with, and they've got this. So there's Gemini, which you can run in the cloud, and then Gemma, which is a lightweight version of these open source, the lightweight version that is open source, which means you can download Gemma and use it locally. And how does it make them lightweight? When I mentioned in the very beginning about some parameters being very, very small, those can be pruned, and these models can be made a lot smaller and more efficient and downloadable and then usable in a local way. Notebooklm.google.com is amazing site. If you haven't heard of it before, you can upload a PDF and you can click a button on there and it'll turn it into a podcast and have two people read it, kind of discuss the paper or whatever you've uploaded and read it to you. Amazon, the Anthropic models are very popular. Claude, which is really is a really powerful model, and then Sonnet, which is a version of Claude that's tuned for performance and cost. All of these models, they have all these different capabilities. You see some of the billions of parameters that are listed here and things like that. These are all ways of looking at these models, but it's really hard, right? We often get the question, well, which model should I use? What are the trade-offs? What do we do? Well, in terms of these open source tools, the smaller models are obviously, they're not going to probably give you the expressiveness that you see with these really large models that you can access through the cloud. But what they do offer you is the ability to download them, isolate them. If you have data that you really don't want to upload to the cloud, whether it's PII or HIPAA data, or if it's just intellectual property that you don't feel comfortable uploading to the cloud, this is a way to interact with these texts in a very secure and isolated way that you have total control over. Furthermore, there's obviously reduced latency in interacting with them for something in the cloud versus local, and the cost, of course. There's always a cost associated with these cloud models. And it's typically the way you install them. You can either submit a ticket if you have an HPC center and you want them to do it, or you can download it yourself from a repo. The larger models, of course, there is a lot of, I should say, there are a lot of cloud resources that have been made available through NAIR that may not, maybe a lot of the costs are handled through these NAIR allocations, and so those may be available that way. The criteria that people use is, of course, number of parameters, but maybe the number of tokens as well, like how big an input your right prompt can I give. And you can keep interacting with these, right, iteratively, but eventually there's a buffer that gets run over, and then it starts to forget basically things that you prompted it with earlier. And so the number of tokens is often a very important way of determining which model to use. Some of these models are multilingual. Some of them can handle multimodal, which means text, sound, images. That's the multimodal thing. Mixture of experts is a new development where multiple models are used and the prompt is fed to these different models. And then you sort of have, a couple of them that can interact with each other and decide. And then this new reasoning capabilities that we've been seeing, where it's able to go through, especially in mathematical or scientific types of developments, where we're able to see what exactly are the specific steps in its reasoning process to give you the answer that it does. the ways in which we interact with these. So one is, as we're familiar with, the chat type of interactive session, but there's also batch, where let's say you wanted to submit thousands of prompts. You can locally have a model, right? And you could submit thousands of jobs and all of them submit maybe a single prompt or a series of prompts within them, but then you can get thousands of outputs back without having to do this manually in an interactive session. Um, an API is often provided with a lot of these cloud models, and this is a way to sort of have the same kind of, to do the batch type of interactions, or at least the non-interactive types of interactions with models in the cloud. And then finally, those containers I was mentioning earlier. Um, I've gotten to the end of this. I do want to say that there's this new capabilities of agentic AI, which is where we can have these. Now when you go to GPT-4, you prompt it. It's not just sending your prompt into this model anymore, but there's these agentic. Oftentimes there are these agentic actions it's taking to go out to the web. It looks, so you might find that when you're prompting it about something that's current, something that's happening right now, even though this model might have been trained months ago, it's able to get current information and integrate it into its response. These are just one example of all the agentic types of things that these models are capable of now to make them fulfill roles such as a research assistant or roles like that. And then further down the road, we're going to see this physical AI where robotics and autonomous vehicles are going to be able to use this. Anyway, I just want to say this was not an exhaustive thing. I tried to do sort of a whirlwind tour through a variety of these things. I did try to create the image again just last night. I did get a 3x3x3 cube in the hands of that walrus. Although, just to remind me that these models are still maybe a little bit more to go, is a 3x3x2 cube resting in the middle of the table. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Gil. That was a fantastic presentation. I would encourage anybody that has questions to drop those into the Q&A so that Gil can answer that live for everyone. Yes, Bob. We had a attendee ask, will this recording be made available? And the recording will absolutely be made available typically within 2 weeks, and we will make sure to send a link to each and every one of you. And we do have our next question, which is any data available yet on the performance of AlphaFold 3?
Um, Yeah, that's a great question. AlphaFold 3, I don't know if it was brought to the CASP competition and how well it performed there. I'm not sure of that, but I will tell you that the thing about AlphaFold 3 that's really spectacular is that they've moved a bit beyond just the so basically the prompt is a series of amino acids and the output is a structure. Well, now you can give it multiple amino acid structures. So if you want to see how maybe two proteins dock with each other, so these sort of multimer configurations are really are supported. It's actually able to solve for structures of not just amino acids, but for DNA-based structures. It can do docking to ligands. It has a lot more. It's a lot more versatile than the previous versions of AlphaFold were, and I think those are the strong selling points of it.
Thanks, Gil. So we have another question. Is agentic, Anas asked this, is agentic AI models open source? How can these be integrated with applications?
Yeah, I do believe there are open source agentic models available. Although I can't, one doesn't come to mind specifically, but I believe these are being tested. I'll say this. On our system, what we do have are some open source large language models that we can prompt, and they do interact with these web search types of models and are able to do that. So we have implemented this. I just can't remember the name of the web search tool that is invoked by the model, but certainly that capability is available locally and open source.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gil. We have a anonymous question. I know Monai works well with images. Do you know if Monai also does multiple hospital surgery video annotations and AI trainings?
I don't know that, but I have to tell you, I would suspect that kind of support is probably, if it doesn't exist, it's got to be in the works. This is a yet another one of these software tools that NVIDIA has produced that is really just been a game changer in terms uh, of uh, of in terms of the capabilities of what can be brought to bear these uh, by AI. And so I would, yeah, I would suggest going to the Monai site and checking out all the variety of things. I haven't even updated myself on the latest features of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's there.
Thanks, Gil. We'll wait a few more moments to see if there are any more questions. Okay, we have another one that just
Mhm.
came in. So when Lee is asking, in your experience, are general LLMs good for scientific literature review, or special LLMs need to be built for domain-specific literature review?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned these domain-specific large language models, and what they really are is these have been trained on these specific corpuses of text, or they've been possibly fine-tuned. Maybe they take the parameters of a large language model that was more general, and they fine-tuned it for this. Now, the more straightforward, or not straightforward, but what a very popular approach to sort of being able to interrogate domain-specific PDFs with a general model is a implementation called a RAG. Um, and what it does is it takes that corpus of text. There's a process where the corpus of text is vectorized, which means basically, much like these embeddings, it's turned into a numerical representation of all the text in there, and then it's loaded into a database in RAM. And then what the large language model is used for is it's able to take prompts and vectorize those prompts in such a way and do a similarity search into this database and be able to pull out information from this corpus of PDFs that separately was encoded in that way. And these tend to be really well received. They tend to perform extremely well. Um, and 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 what I would say is what our experience with these domain specific models has not been as positive. I mean, we installed them, we got them up running on a VM and with a prompt, and I typed in some chemistry questions to the chemistry specific one. And I'm not a chemistry researcher, so I just said, can you give me the chemical structure of a substance that smells like lavender and feels oily in texture? And it gave me back this huge chemical formula. And I thought, wow, this thing is incredible. I mean, it gave me I could even ask it how to synthesize that substance. So then I said, okay, well, let me show this to a couple of chemists. So I sent it to them, and they were prompting it with real research questions that they had. And they came back and they said, this thing is it doesn't seem to really know what it's talking about. And similarly with Astrosage, I try to ask it some what I thought were, astronomy questions as far as I understood them, and they seemed, but I gave it to these two astronomers, and their responses were very lukewarm. Uh, but what's interesting is that but all these people did this in comparison to running on GPT-4. And they went in and they asked their question, and GPT-4 went out and it does this web search agentically, was able to field their questions no matter how complicated they were and give answers they felt were much better than the domain specific tune models. Now, these domain specific models have a lot fewer parameters, right? They're local and and they're installed there. And these cloud models are huge, right? They have large numbers of parameters. And it seems to me that what we're seeing here is sort of maybe a trade-off, between a model that's knowledgeable but not very expressive, and a model that's very expressive, and is able to sort of find the information it needs to be able to answer in a way that people find satisfying. Um, it's I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe that we're just in the beginning of the development of these domain-specific models, and maybe we will see a lot of improvement there. But I find that result pretty interesting.
Thanks, Gil. So we have two more questions that came in, actually three. And so what I just want to take a moment to say is that if we don't answer your question here, we'll make sure to follow up with you. So I'm going to try to get through two quickly. So the first one is from Iwan. This is my research is on sign language recognition and small multilingual language models. Do you have any state of the art in this particular area?
I don't, but boy, that's interesting. I want to go look that up now. That's super cool. Yeah, I encourage you to go look or ask ChatGPT about it. I bet you give you a much more satisfying answer than I could give.
Perfect, Gil. Thank you. I'll jump to the other one that came in at the same time. So this is from Ji Yun, and this is thanks for the great talk. I heard there's a recent study from MIT showing that people that use more AI tend to have sort of lower and slower and less brain activity later on. It seems that people in our brain will be much, in quotes, lazier in the AI era. Should we be concerned about this? And how do we keep people maintaining that creative thinking?
I just read an article that was in last week's New York Times weekend Sunday review by Megan O'Rourke. I highly recommend reading this article. She's a literature professor, and and her insights about this very thing are I thought were really profound. Um, yeah, I did, and she cites that very same study. So it is interesting. Look, we're in the middle of an inflection point. There's no question, I'm not sure what I'm not a soothsayer, and I don't know what's ahead. But it is going to be complicated how we adjust to this new development.
Thanks, Gil. So then we have a final question, and this is a tough one. So can academics compete with, and this is from Anonymous, with industry partners who have, hundreds of thousands of GPUs and top money to pay AI talents? Or will academics be more at the mercy of industry for computing power?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that I think this is a great concluding question because here we are. This is the Nair pilot, right? Here we have the United States government has made a significant investment in AI and making these types of tools available. Please look into the Nair resources that are available. They are, pretty powerful, and we're hopefully academics and the entire research effort in this country is going to be given the tools it needs to be competitive. Industry has its own motivations and the things it needs to do, and academics and research have very different ones. And hopefully we'll be able to match what industry has available to it in terms of these tools. But there is certainly a gap that is noticeable in terms of who has access to AI and who doesn't. And I hope that Nair is yet just one of these efforts to bridge that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gil, and thank you to all of our attendees. This was a fantastic presentation with Q&A. As we indicated earlier, there will be a recording. We'll make sure to get that up onto our YouTube in approximately 2 weeks, and we will send out a link to everyone who is in attendance today. So thank you again to our presenter, Gil, and we look forward to seeing everyone else on future webinars. Have a great rest of your week.